Hi guys. So with all the political developments in the world today, especially with the rise of the alt-right all over the world, it seems like everybody is predicting societal collapse. This is an excellent topic for a science fiction channel because post-apocalyptic fiction is a staple of the genre. So what would societal collapse look like? Luckily, we don't have to do a lot of guessing because this has happened before, and we can extrapolate from that. So let's talk about societal collapse. Before we go any further, make sure to click like and subscribe. That way you'll get to see more content like this. Also, to help other people find this content. You can also join my Patreon. There'll be links down below. And a reminder at the end of the video. For now, enjoy the rest of the video. So, this is a remake of a previous video. I did mention in the last channel update that I would be remaking some of my earlier videos. This is one of them. The original video I didn't even write an outline for. I just said what I was thinking. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but you can get it all in your head straight what you want to say. But once that camera turns on, everything changes. So that video wasn't very good. On the flip side, I was looking through my analytics and apparently that video gets a lot of attention. Maybe a higher quality version. So that's what we're doing. That's what this is. So let's start with some definitions. Now, there is a word for the study of societal collapse. It's called, predictably, collapsology. And it's one of those interdisciplinary studies. Biologists, anthropologists, archaeologists, physicists, everybody's studying it in some form. Now, Wikipedia defines societal collapse as the fall of a complex human society characterized by the loss of cultural identity and of social complexity as an adaptive system, the downfall of government, and the rise of violence. And there are numerous potential causes. I'm sure you know what they are already. Climate change, war, plague, overpopulation, underpopulation, etc. The usual suspects. And it has happened in the past. So let's talk about some historical examples. Let's talk about the Indus Valley Civilization. It is one of the first major collapses that we see. Some of their contemporaries also collapsed around the same time. Now, this particular civilization isn't talked about a lot in American history classes when you start covering ancient civilizations, because American history classes focus on what developed into so-called Western culture, and the Indus Valley Civilization was not that. And it's really a shame because by all accounts, it was more advanced technologically, possibly culturally, than its contemporaries, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and so forth. We don't really know a lot about them through their written records because we haven't figured out how to decipher their script. It's a unique script, and they're not genetically linked to modern Indians. So whatever they did after the collapse, we don't know. We don't really know where they went. So it was a civilization-ending event, unlike some of the others we'll be talking about. There are lots of causes, which we can see in the archaeological record. There's a huge increase in diseases like leprosy and tuberculosis. There were earthquakes, there was flooding, there was a huge drought in Africa, which changed the monsoons, leading to a whole shitload more flooding. And there's also a significant sea level drop, which we know because there are cities that at the time the civilization existed, they would have been coastal cities, but now they're inland, a couple miles. But there is so much more here that we don't know. But it does look like the collapse would have wiped out the people, leaving possibly refugees that would have settled elsewhere, possibly in Iran or the Andaman island chain, because genetic studies have linked the people in this civilization to those people. Of course, there's the late Bronze Age collapse. This is one of the most famous. There's a lot of information about it, a lot of misinformation about it. And while we definitely don't really know the causes, we have identified a number of potential causes. There's a whole bunch of debate about this. This is one of the biggest single topics of study in archaeology right now. Now, it did happen around the same time as the Indus Valley Civilization collapse, but it does look like it was a separate event, although it may have been influenced, for example, by the big drought. But for the most part, the people involved in this collapse survived, albeit with significantly reduced populations. They abandoned their cities, but they did ultimately rebuild their respective civilizations. Normally, we focus on the Greeks when we talk about this. Everybody around there had something happen. Egypt was significantly weakened, but they did survive the collapse. But there were some, whoever was on the Anatolian Peninsula at the time, they just collapse. And this is also the collapse that marks the two different periods in Greek civilization, where all the Greek legends happened before the collapse. Of course, they didn't really happen, but you'll see what I mean. And then after the collapse is when the Hellenistic Greeks developed. But what I mean about the Greek legends happening before the collapse, Agamemnon was the king of Athens or wherever before the collapse. And he was a real king. But in legend, he went to the island and he slew the Minotaur. And we know Minotaurs aren't real, so obviously he didn't do that. Now, most of the cities built before the collapse weren't reoccupied afterwards, mostly because it took so long to recover that a lot of them were good and buried by the time they started rebuilding cities. Some of the cities were reoccupied, but the cultures mostly survived, but they did change, because there's like 500 years here. And so the cultures did change. And we don't really know what they did in that time period. It's dark to us. It's a dark age. It's dark. Probably one of the most famous collapses people have been talking about recently is the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is big and influential and all of that. It's the reason Europe is Christian. And it did lead to a period of like 500 years worth of dark ages, because the Roman Empire, the end of the Roman Empire is like 4 something CE. And we don't really get written records throughout Europe again until 900, 1000 CE. I do want to point out that a dark age, because this is the second one I mentioned so far, it's not a period of time where people are primitive or backwards, superstitious, or any of that crap. And I say this because a lot of time the medieval period is referred to as a dark age. And it's not, because what makes something a dark age is there's no written records. It is dark to us. We cannot see what happened because there's no written records or history during that time. When we do finally get written histories, hundreds of years later, not really very accurate. So in any case, cultures that were left over after the collapse of the Roman Empire continued to develop. Now, if you recall from history, Rome didn't directly govern places like Gaul or Britannia or whatever. They let the local leaders govern for the most part. So they didn't really, like, there was some Romanizing going on, but the original cultures remained largely intact. So when the empire fell, they continued to develop. And so, Gauls stayed Gauls, Visigoths stayed Visigoths, and so forth, and ultimately emerged as the modern cultures of France and the Iberian Peninsula, which it's not just Spain and Portugal, it's on that peninsula. This is also when the Angles and Saxons intermingled, creating the modern Anglo-Saxon ethnic group. And as for causes, there were so many. I mean, a big empire like the Roman Empire doesn't collapse just because of one thing. So there was a lot of climate change, which was driving other groups to migrate, climate refugees basically, invading the Roman Empire, putting a lot of stress on it. Disease, political instability, all sorts of stuff. And while the Roman Empire itself never really recovered, all of the various cultures ultimately did, and they rebuilt, which led to, the medieval European state. And there's the Mayan collapse. And in North America, there are several worth talking about, but we're going to focus on the Mayan collapse right now. This happened around 800 CE. For whatever reasons, the then Mayan people abandoned most of their cities, most of the lowland cities. I understand the ones higher up in the mountains, they didn't abandon. And so the empire itself contracted quite a bit. They did sort of recover, meaning they didn't die out or become extinct. They were never as big again as they were before this collapse. Now, this specific collapse is a very active topic of study right now. So I don't want to try to tell you what happened, just have a new study come out a year from now that completely shoots that down. But we do know that climate change was a big contributor. There were a lot of other factors, and archaeologists are still working through this. Then in China, famously, there was a period of the warring state. A lot of people might disagree with me calling this a societal collapse. Hear me out. There was previously a bigger state in China with an emperor and all that. There were some pressures from outside, the marauding hordes, the nomads, or whatever you want to call them. This caused the then emperor to have to move to a different city, build a new capital. His old capital got conquered. He was burned to the ground or something, destroyed, whatever. He was relying on the then noble class to hold him up. Well, the nobles were like, you know what? It's ours now. Arrgh. And so the centralized government collapsed, which led to the period of the warring states, where there were a bunch of different states. And while Chinese society was mostly left alone, sort of, because the warring states period is also when Confucianism and, the others all developed. Taoism is one of them. And it did take some time to rebuild, in part because there was a lot of warring going on. It wasn't really an apocalyptic collapse, but it was a more thorough collapse than, say, the American Civil War or the 30 Years' War in Europe. Then we have what amounts to a series of collapses in North America. And these all started when Christopher Columbus showed up. Some of the collapsing was intentional. The conquering of the Aztecs and the Incas and the Mayas and burning their written records and all that stuff. And so those cultures, they still survived, but they're much And a lot was lost. It has been shown because, of course, the Vikings were there way back in like the 1100s or something, and they were unable to maintain a foothold in North America because there just wasn't room. The whole continent was settled, and as strong as the Vikings were, they could not defeat the natives and hold them back long enough to build a sustainable colony, and ended up getting run off the continent. When Christopher Columbus showed up and the various explorers that came after that, they brought with them European diseases, which have been shown to account for a 90% population loss throughout North America among the indigenous people between 1492 and the early 1600s, when the first British colonies were made. And those colonies were, of course, very successful. I mean, even then, you still had Jamestown. Don't know what happened there, and they just disappeared. There's a few other failed colonies. But then once they figured out how to make them, make money off these colonies. So there was a collapse. Without the diseases, Europeans never would have been able to settle. So without that collapse, that apocalypse in North America, the United States wouldn't exist. In Canada, Mexico, none of us would be here. A lot of the cultures, despite the diseases, still survived. Granted, they were significantly weakened. Some of them had to go back to being hunter-gatherers. Some of them were forced into being hunter-gatherers when, Europeans came and took their land from them. And the cultures now are as strong as they've ever been, despite the numerous attempts to completely destroy them that have been made over the last 500 years. But with that said, there are a lot of tribal cultures that just died out completely when all the members of the tribes died, whether it's from disease or massacre or whatever. Some as recently as the 19th century, and possibly more in the 20th century. Then there's the Cold War collapse. There is an argument to be said that there was something of a mass societal collapse in Eastern Europe when the Iron Curtain fell. I don't know if I would go so far as to call it a societal collapse, but there was famine, warfare, disease, everything was there, and a lot of people died. And you can see the remnants of the effects today. Some countries like Poland, which had a peaceful transition of power when they went from communist to not communist, are generally in better shape than countries like Romania or Moldova, which had civil wars. But it is worth looking at Russia in particular because while it didn't collapse exactly, the transition wasn't smooth. The 90s were really rough on Russia, part of why we got Putin now. They failed, for example, to set up a strong centralized government with good regulations and stuff, and so now they're run by an oligarchy. The president alternately beholden to the oligarchy and being a dictator. And this all came about in a power vacuum left by the collapsing USSR, and there were civil wars in some of the former Soviet states. There's massive unemployment, movement of refugees, general instability, and that's what the 90s in Russia was like. I mention this one because while it isn't what we would consider societal collapse, like, say, the Roman Empire or the Mayans or the Indus Valley civilization, it does give us an idea of what a modern societal collapse might look like. So what does a modern societal collapse look like? All right, well, given the strength of modern centralized governments, to be even considered a societal collapse, I think the government needs to collapse. Whether it happens all at once or if it happens piecemeal, doesn't really matter as long as the old government ceases to exist or becomes warped beyond all recognition. So, a particular leader could take over the government and then run it so incompetently that the states and local governments have to step up. So, say, for example, if such an incompetent leader were in charge during a worldwide pandemic, and in order to limit the damages from the pandemic, state, country, and city governments had to independently enact a series of quarantine measures to slow down the spread of this pandemic. You could see that as the beginning of a collapse scenario. Of course, then you could have an election which would change, that leader out, and then someone else can actually fix all the problems. But the idea is there. If the federal government showed itself to be incapable of governing, the state and city and county governments would all have to step in, and that would weaken and possibly at some point eliminate the federal government. And I think that would be a good starting point when you want to talk about America collapsing. But what would happen next? Maybe one of the larger, more economically wealthy states might secede, taking with it a large amount of the country's GDP as a whole. Of course, there's still a large international community capable of providing aid and trade and even peacekeeping forces should a local war break out. There are other powers in the world like Russia or China which would use the weakened state of the US to make moves in other parts of the world. But they don't generally have an interest in wiping out the cultures they want to dominate. They still need the people there. They don't really care about the cultures as long as the people can be subjugated. And that's not really a global societal collapse anyway. So at this point, we have a big state like maybe Texas seceding from the United States and a fairly ineffective federal government. And then politically similar states would ally together. They'd make their groups. And given enough time, they might even establish their own regional federal governments, at which point the existing federal government is gone. Now the United States is in several smaller countries. What's left of the federal government might move in troops to try to stop all of this from happening, and then there may be a civil war, but there may not be. But I do think the U.S. would break down into 4 or 5 smaller federal republics with borders largely on current party lines. So, Washington, Oregon, and California would be one. Maybe Nevada would join them. Maybe they'd manage to get Arizona. Texas probably be by themselves, but then you'd see Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, all coming together. Maybe the old Confederacy minus Texas would reform. I do think there would be one actual theocracy put in place. It would probably be in the Bible Belt. And so in this scenario, I think maybe at most 1% of the American population would die. We could have a pandemic, something much worse than COVID. But I do think we learned during COVID that we can actually weather a pandemic pretty well. I mean, there are a disturbing number of people who resisted or outright ignored the protocols that were put in place to slow COVID. Most of them were conservative, so the end result of another pandemic, especially a more dangerous one, would just be fewer conservatives in the country. That would be a huge loss, don't get me wrong, but since the people who would actually be trying to fight the pandemic tend to be liberal, our ability to continue fighting the pandemic wouldn't be hurt by conservatives ignoring all the instructions, getting themselves killed. And now that we've already seen the problems that would come up in the supply chain during a global pandemic, we're actually in much better shape to keep the supply chain going and to recover after the pandemic's over. So I do think we can safely weather any pandemic that takes out as much as, say, 10% of the global population. Now, more than that, and we start to have some real serious issues, we have the paradox of both mass unemployment and mass understaffing. Like we already have, but it would be much worse because the money wouldn't be there to pay the people that aren't there. So the people who don't have jobs wouldn't be able to get them. But the people who take any pandemic on the nose do tend to be the most poorly paid people. So we could see a big enough pandemic that would put Jeff Bezos working at McDonald's or Elon Musk. I'm sorry, I'm just not taking this scenario seriously enough. We've already survived COVID. Let's call that a win and move on, okay? So what about a nuclear apocalypse? Now, most people predict the end of all life on the planet. But I've been watching actual nuclear engineers talk about how nuclear weapons work, and it really doesn't look that bad. Could only be like 60% of life in the northern hemisphere dies. The southern hemisphere would mostly be left alone. But because of how NATO works, and how the U.S. views its rivals in the world. If there's a nuclear exchange, the U.S., Europe, Russia, China, and parts of the Middle East would all guaranteed get hit. India and Pakistan might get hit. Australia, Canada might also get hit. Probably not. And that would leave Australia and New Zealand as the biggest Western powers. Now, Canada would suffer a lot of damage just because of its proximity to the United States, preventing it from rising as a Western power immediately, but it would recover much faster than the U.S. It would also open the door for increased immigration from Mexico, Central and South America, while simultaneously decreasing immigration. What I mean by that is there's a lot of people who would want to come over that would stop because they don't want to live in a nuclear wasteland. There's a lot of people who would see a nuclear wasteland as being more a land of opportunity than the existing United States, so they would still come over. Now, all the big cities of the U.S. would be destroyed, also most of the smaller big cities, along with every military installation. I would expect the agricultural areas to remain intact, so I hope Russia's not paying attention to this video, because if you really want to destroy the United States, you need to hit the agricultural areas too. You can't just nuke the big cities. So please don't do that. This would lead to the formation of several new states in the U.S. that would replace whatever was there before with at least one theocracy, basically like the first scenario. I would expect to see similar states like that cropping up in Europe, Russia as well. I would also generally expect China to remain China. They might have lost 80% of their population, but they'll still stay together and be China. I don't know if they'd start a new republic or stay communist, but I wouldn't rule out the return of the Chinese emperors. Without the U.S. to support it, Israel would probably be invaded by their neighbors, and that would cause a long and bloody war in the area. The remaining countries wouldn't really be in a position to move into all the freshly nuked areas. So for the most part, I'd expect the populations in like the United States and Europe and so forth to have a fair amount of time to rebuild. But I don't think political relations in Africa or South or Central America would be significantly affected. A few countries might realign themselves, but I would expect expect that current balances of power for the most part to remain unaffected. Not because they don't depend on the United States or Russia or Europe or whatever, but because after you remove those countries as powers, it's still the same people, still the same relationships. The new global world order will probably be dominated by Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Brazil, South Africa, possibly India, depending on whether or not India and Pakistan nuked each other. Within 100 years or so, I would expect to see whatever states took over in the nuked territories to take their places on the world stage again. But long term, I think it would set us back a few hundred years in development, but overall we'd recover. Now you notice I'm not predicting a huge ecological disaster normally associated with nuclear winter. That's because it turns out nuclear warheads are actually cleaner than we give them credit for being. Most of the fallout happens during the explosion. It doesn't get, the area doesn't stay irradiated. They rebuilt Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and both of those cities have more ongoing radiation than modern H-bombs would leave behind, because modern H-bombs are much cleaner, also much more devastating. There would be some localized fallout issues, and those areas would get quarantined. And while people still heavily debate nuclear winter and its effects, actual nuclear engineers consider it mostly a fiction. So that's why I'm not predicting that. But I think the big one is going to be climate change. And this is potentially an extinction event for all of us. It's also the one that's actually happening right now. Somewhere around 80% of the human population lives in cities that are going to be destroyed by rising sea level. New York, Houston, Miami, London, St. Petersburg, Sydney, and so forth. And the remaining population lives in areas that are going to change drastically because of the changing climate. We're talking farmland that's going to turn into arid desert because of the changing climate. There's going to be a huge refugee crisis like nothing we have ever had before. With all these cities flooding with ocean water, even if the ocean levels recede later, that land will not be arable because of all the salt water that was on it. So obviously there's massive disruption to international trade, massive unemployment, as entire cities are swallowed by the ocean, and they will be swallowed slowly enough that people will have time to evacuate. And current production just isn't enough to build new cities farther inland. Not to mention that the best sites on which to build new cities already have cities on them. And those cities don't have the carrying capacity to take in all these refugees. Nobody can take in, 50 million people or whatever that live in New York City. And then at a certain point, between the loss of arable farmland and the need to accommodate all these refugees, food production worldwide is going to drop well below the level needed to sustain the population. So famine will wipe out at least 50% of the existing population. Disease, because we're going to see a comeback of dysentery, cholera, and so forth, and that could easily take out another 25%. That's 75% of the population right there in the next, 100 years. And no country will be spared either. Some countries are going to lose upwards of 90% of their population. And I expect at some point we would see people moving back into the flooded cities, at least the ones that have buildings that stick up out of the water. They'll make adaptations to work on the structures so that they'll actually be fine having, the first couple of floors underwater and the foundation. And then ocean life will be in this really weird position where it'll finally have the space to recover from all the human farming, all the fishing and stuff. But then it's going to be suffering significantly because of all the carbonic acid that comes from all the CO2 in the atmosphere. Because when the CO2 gets absorbed into the ocean, it creates carbonic acid. And then we'll go through a more extreme water cycle where, because of the extreme temperatures, water evaporates faster, and also a lot more of it will evaporate. So more clouds, which will increase albedo, which will cause some cooling, but then all the water gets dumped, flooding all the land. The clouds disappear, temperatures go back up. So that's a much more extreme water cycle than what we experience right now. Of course, will give us more dangerous storms, more dangerous wildfires, more of what we're already seeing. And so whether or not we'll survive at this point will depend on the survivor's ability to adapt. Now, we will lose a lot of technology also because we won't be able to keep making it. There won't be enough people to keep making it. We won't be able to educate new people, not just on how to make technology, but how to engineer it. There will be a loss of information, a loss of knowledge. And so if we do survive, I'd expect there to be a gap of like a century or more before we have new electrical engineers and computer engineers, rocket engineers, and all that kind of stuff. And when that does happen, there'll be moving a lot more slowly because they won't have people to teach them. They're going to have to learn from book, reverse engineering, older technology, that sort of thing. They'll also be suffering a serious labor shortage. But when robotic technology is recovered, that's going to be the new slave class. We already know that's going to be the new slave class. It'll be much more important. So think of the climate change at this point as being similar to the Black Death that went through Europe, creating a huge labor shortage in Europe, which paves the way for the North Atlantic slave trade. I would expect to see inland universities becoming repositories of knowledge, even if they don't manage to keep all the teachers. They'll also become centers for refugees to seek assistance, so that'll be interesting to see how that happens. It could be another 300 to 500 years before survivors are able to get back to our current levels of technology. And if we make it that far, I would expect society to have changed enough that we'll have new ways of living that will prevent another climate change disaster for at least 1,000 years. But after that, no guarantees. That's if we survive anyway. I guess we'll see. And we will see. Well, you might. I'm old enough that hopefully I'm not going to have to deal with this. All right, so in conclusion, I do actually think that for the most part, we are immune to the types of historical societal collapses that we've seen. The rise of globalization has made it so that there are many sources of aid, many sources of food. So famine in one area doesn't have to kill a lot of people. Well, food shortages in one area doesn't have to lead to famine when we can just ship in food from a different area. We do have a wealth distribution problem. We don't have a wealth production problem. There is enough money and enough food on the planet to feed everybody. We just got to figure out how to do it. The point is, when one part of the world is suffering, it's possible for the rest of the world to come to their aid. Now, it doesn't happen as often as it should, but in order to have a societal collapse, there needs to be either an event so extreme that the world population is significantly destroyed, or an extreme event that happens in one region that gets ignored by everybody else. Otherwise, even in a nuclear apocalypse, I'd expect Mexico and South America to become sources of aid to the US, Europe, and Asia. We would have a rising Africa, and they would help everybody to rebuild. That's not to say that there isn't some other great filter that could still wipe us out completely. It's just that we're at a point where the great filters that we currently know about would simply reduce us to a previous level of development, and then we would recover. There could be periodic 5,000-year cycles of being mostly destroyed and then recovering. That could happen. But historically, the big extinction events have always happened to species who lacked the ability to adapt. Or there were survivors that were able to adapt, but they had to rely on evolution. We have the ability to adapt technologically. We don't have to wait several generations for new traits to develop. And so through collective action and technological innovation, we can handle a lot, actually. Despite all the chaos in the world today, I actually have a high level of confidence that our species will continue on for some time. And I know that's an unpopular opinion to have these days, but I don't care. It's really hard to destroy humans as a species. We've already survived so much, and we keep coming out stronger, so we're going to get through it.